The gunshot tore through the silence of the valley, just as Henry Morrison dove behind the outcropping of rocks, and he felt the sharp sting across his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him and torn clean through his favorite shirt. The fabric hung in shreds as he clutched his rifle and tried to catch his breath. 3 rustlers had been trailing him for the better part of 2 hours, determined to take the small herd of cattle he had been driving toward Circleville, Utah Territory, where he planned to sell them for enough money to last through the coming winter of 1878. Henry was 26 years old and had been working cattle since he was barely tall enough to reach a stirrup. His father had died when he was 14, leaving him to care for his mother and younger sister until they both succumbed to fever 5 years later. Since then, he had been alone, drifting from ranch to ranch, taking odd jobs, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. The loneliness had settled into his bones like the cold mountain air, something he barely noticed anymore because it had become so much a part of him. The rustlers fired again, and Henry returned fire, hoping to keep them at bay until darkness fell. His shoulder burned where the bullet had creased it, and blood was seeping through what remained of his shirt. He counted his ammunition and realized he had maybe 6 shots left. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the red rocks of southern Utah in shades of copper and gold. If he could hold out another hour, he might have a chance to slip away in the darkness. He heard the rustlers conferring among themselves, their voices carrying on the wind. They were getting impatient, probably worried that someone might hear the gunfire and come investigating. Henry knew that was unlikely. This stretch of land between the high desert and the mountain passes was sparsely populated, and those who lived here minded their own business. Still, the rustlers did not know that for certain, and their uncertainty was his only advantage. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and Henry realized they were trying to flank him. He shifted position, pressing himself against the cold stone, and aimed carefully at the shadow moving among the sage and juniper. He squeezed the trigger, and the shadow dropped. A cry of pain confirmed his shot had found its mark. The remaining 2 rustlers opened fire in earnest, peppering the rocks around him with bullets. Henry waited for a lull in the shooting, then fired twice more in rapid succession. He heard cursing and the sound of horses being hastily mounted. When he dared to look, he saw the 2 remaining rustlers riding hard to the south, apparently deciding the cattle were not worth dying over. He watched until they disappeared over a ridge, then slowly stood, his legs shaking from the adrenaline. The wounded rustler was crawling toward his horse about 50 yards away. Henry approached carefully, his rifle trained on the man, but as he got closer, he could see the wound was not fatal. The bullet had struck the man's thigh. Without a word, Henry fired a shot into the air near the rustler's horse, sending it galloping after the others. The wounded man looked up at him with a mixture of fear and hatred. "You can walk to the nearest town if you start now," Henry said flatly. "Or you can bleed out here. Your choice." The rustler spat but said nothing, and Henry turned away, heading back to where he had left his own horse with the small herd of cattle. His shoulder throbbed with each step, and he could feel blood still trickling down his arm. The torn shirt flapped uselessly in the breeze. He would need to tend to the wound soon, but first he needed to get the cattle moving. Circleville was still a good day's ride, and he wanted to put more distance between himself and any friends the rustlers might have. By the time darkness fell completely, Henry had pushed the cattle another 5 miles. He made camp in a small canyon where a spring provided water for both him and the animals. He built a small fire and used what was left of his shirt to try to clean and bandage his shoulder. The wound was not deep, but it was long and would need proper attention. He had a spare shirt in his saddlebag, but it was threadbare and had its own collection of holes and tears. As he sat by the fire, chewing on hardtack and jerky, Henry thought about what he would do once he sold the cattle. Maybe he would stay in Circleville for a while, see if anyone needed help with the late harvest or with preparing for winter. Maybe he would just keep moving, as he always did. The thought of staying anywhere filled him with a restless anxiety he could not quite name. It was easier to keep moving, easier not to let anyone get close enough to matter. He slept fitfully that night, waking at every sound, his hand on his rifle. When dawn broke cold and clear, he was already breaking camp. The cattle were rested and moved more easily as he guided them north along the old wagon road. The landscape here was stark and beautiful, with towering red cliffs rising on either side of the valley, and the distant peaks of the mountains still holding snow on their highest elevations. By midday, he could see the scattered buildings of Circleville ahead. It was not much of a town, maybe 24 structures clustered around a main street, but it had a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and most importantly, a cattle buyer who would give him a fair price. As he drove the herd down the main street, people stopped to watch. A woman with 2 small children hurried them inside. An old man sitting outside the general store raised a hand in greeting. Henry guided the cattle to the holding pen behind the general store where the buyer, a man named Samuel who Henry had dealt with before, was already waiting. Samuel looked at the cattle with a practiced eye, walked among them, checking their condition, then nodded. "Fair price for fair cattle," Samuel said, and named a figure that was exactly what Henry had hoped for. They shook hands, and Samuel counted out the money in silver dollars and paper notes. Henry pocketed the money carefully, then turned his attention to his more immediate needs. His shoulder was still bleeding through the makeshift bandage, and he knew he looked rough. Samuel noticed his torn shirt and the blood. "You run into trouble?" Samuel asked. "Rustlers," Henry said simply. "3 of them. They decided the cattle were not worth it." Samuel nodded. "You should see Theresa. She runs the boarding house at the end of the street. She is good with injuries, better than the circuit doctor who only comes through once a month. She can fix that shoulder and probably find you a clean shirt, too." Henry thanked him and led his horse down the dusty street. The boarding house was a 2-story building with a wide porch and curtains in the windows. A sign hanging from the porch roof read, "Norwood Boarding House, Clean Rooms and Hot Meals." He tied his horse to the hitching post and climbed the steps, each movement making his shoulder throb. The front door was open, and he knocked on the frame. A voice from inside called, "Come in." He stepped into a front room that served as both parlor and dining area. The furniture was simple but well-maintained, and everything was spotlessly clean. The smell of fresh bread and something savory cooking made his stomach growl, reminding him he had eaten nothing but hardtack since the day before. A woman emerged from what he assumed was the kitchen. She was younger than he expected, probably around 23 or 24, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and gray eyes that were both sharp and kind. She wore a simple calico dress with an apron over it, and flour dusted her hands. When she saw him, her eyes immediately went to his blood-stained shoulder and torn shirt. "You need tending," she said, her voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Sit down before you fall down." Henry opened his mouth to protest that he was fine, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He sat in the nearest chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The woman disappeared for a moment and returned with a basin of water, clean cloth, and a small box that he assumed contained medical supplies. "I am Theresa Norwood," she said as she began carefully cutting away what remained of his shirt. "And you look like you have had a rough couple of days." "Henry Morrison," he replied, trying not to wince as she peeled the makeshift bandage away from the wound. Ran into some trouble with rustlers yesterday. They got a piece of my shirt and a piece of me. Theresa examined the wound with gentle but efficient hands. Bullet graze. You are lucky. Another inch and it would have been much worse. This will need cleaning and proper bandaging. It is going to hurt. I have had worse, Henry said, though he braced himself as she began washing the wound with water that smelled of herbs. It burned worse than the bullet had, but he kept his jaw clenched and did not make a sound. As Theresa worked, Henry found himself studying her. There was a quiet competence in the way she moved, a sureness that spoke of experience. Her hands were steady, and though her touch was gentle, there was nothing hesitant about it. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, applied some kind of salve that cooled the burning, then wrapped it with clean strips of cloth. You will need to keep this clean and dry, she said as she tied off the bandage. Change the dressing every day. If you see any red streaks or if it starts to smell bad, you need to see a doctor immediately. Do you have somewhere to stay? I was planning to camp outside of town, Henry said. Take a few days to rest before moving on. Theresa stood and looked at him with those sharp gray eyes. That wound needs monitoring. You should stay here. I have rooms available and the price includes 3 meals a day. You can pay, I assume. Henry nodded and pulled out some of the money Samuel had given him. Theresa named a price that was more than fair, and he counted out enough for 3 days. She took the money and tucked it into her apron pocket. Room is upstairs, second door on the right. There is a wash basin and clean water. Dinner is at 6. I will have a shirt for you by then. That one is beyond saving. Henry looked down at the torn, blood-stained remnants of his shirt and had to agree. He gathered what was left of it and stood, swaying slightly. Theresa put a steadying hand on his good arm. When did you last eat a proper meal? She asked. 2 days ago, Henry admitted. Theresa shook her head and guided him toward the stairs. Go rest. I will bring you something to eat within the hour. You are no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion and hunger. Henry wanted to argue, to maintain that he could take care of himself as he always had, but the truth was he felt wrung out like an old dish rag. He climbed the stairs slowly, found the room Theresa had indicated and pushed open the door. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a window that looked out over the street. He sat on the edge of the bed, meaning to take off his boots, but exhaustion caught up with him all at once. He lay back on the quilt and was asleep within seconds. He woke to a gentle knocking on the door. The light coming through the window had changed, suggesting several hours had passed. His shoulder ached, but it was a clean ache, not the burning throb of before. He sat up carefully. Come in, he called, his voice rough. Theresa entered carrying a tray with a bowl of stew, fresh bread, and a cup of coffee. The smell made his mouth water. She set the tray on the small table near the window, then turned to look at him. You slept for 3 hours, she said. How does the shoulder feel? Better, Henry said honestly. Thank you. Theresa nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. I found a shirt that might fit you. It belonged to my father. He passed 2 years ago, but he was about your build. I will leave it outside your door once I have mended it. There are some tears and a few missing buttons. You do not have to do that, Henry said. I have a spare. I am sure you do, Theresa said, and there was the faintest hint of amusement in her voice. But I am also sure it is in no better shape than the one you were wearing. Eat while the food is hot. She left before he could protest further. Henry ate the stew, which was rich with beef and vegetables and better than anything he had eaten in months. The bread was still warm and the coffee was strong and dark. When he finished, he stood and looked out the window at the town below. People were going about their business, a few wagons moving down the street, children playing near the general store. It looked peaceful, ordinary, the kind of place where people put down roots and built lives. The thought made his chest tighten with something he could not quite name. He had been alone for so long, moving from place to place, that the idea of staying anywhere felt foreign and slightly frightening. What would he even do with himself? He knew cattle and horses, could handle a rope and a rifle, but those were skills for moving, for surviving, not for settling. He washed his face and hands in the basin, careful not to get the bandage wet, then lay back down on the bed. He had not intended to sleep again, but his body had other ideas, and he drifted off to the sound of voices from the street below and the distant lowing of cattle. When he woke again, it was dark outside. He could hear the sound of voices and the clatter of dishes from downstairs, and he realized it must be around dinner time. He stood, stretched carefully, and was reaching for his spare shirt from his saddlebag when he noticed something folded neatly on the chair near the door. He picked it up and found a blue cotton work shirt, clean and smelling faintly of soap and sunshine. The tears he had seen earlier were now expertly mended with tiny, even stitches that were barely visible. The buttons had been replaced with ones that matched closely enough that you would not notice unless you looked carefully. Henry held the shirt for a long moment, studying the careful work that had gone into repairing it. He could see where Theresa had reinforced a weak seam, where she had patched a thin spot with fabric that nearly matched the original. It was the work of someone who took pride in what they did, someone who cared about doing things properly. He put the shirt on, surprised at how well it fit. The fabric was soft from many washings but still strong. He buttoned it carefully, then made his way downstairs. The dining room was more crowded than it had been earlier. Several men were seated at the long table, along with an older woman and a younger man who looked like he might be her son. They all looked up as Henry entered. Theresa came through from the kitchen carrying a platter of roasted chicken. She set it on the table, then gestured to an empty chair. "Mr. Morrison, please sit. Everyone, this is our newest guest. He will be staying a few days while he recovers from an injury." The introductions went around the table. There was Robert, a traveling salesman. The older woman was Martha, a widow who had been staying at the boarding house for the past month while her own house was being rebuilt after a fire. The young man was her son, Peter. There were two ranch hands, brothers named Jack and Tom, who worked on a spread about 10 miles south of town. And there was an older gentleman named Ernest, who was the local school teacher. The conversation flowed easily as they ate. Robert told stories of his travels, carefully edited to be appropriate for mixed company. Martha spoke about the progress on her house. Ernest discussed the challenges of teaching when students were needed for harvest work. Henry mostly listened, contributing little, but he found himself relaxing despite his usual caution around strangers. Throughout the meal, he was aware of Theresa moving between the dining room and kitchen, refilling platters, bringing fresh bread, making sure everyone had what they needed. She moved with quiet efficiency, and Henry noticed that she seemed to know exactly what each person needed before they asked. When Ernest's coffee cup was nearly empty, she was there with the pot. When Martha's shawl slipped from her shoulders, Theresa picked it up and draped it back in place. After the meal, the men retired to the porch to smoke while Martha and Theresa cleared the table. Henry helped carry dishes to the kitchen, ignoring Theresa's protest that guests were not expected to work. "You cooked and mended my shirt," Henry said. "The least I can do is carry some dishes." In the kitchen, which was large and well organized, Theresa began washing the dishes in a basin of hot water. Henry found a towel and started drying them without being asked. They worked in companionable silence for several minutes before Theresa spoke. "The shirt fits well," she said. "I am glad." "It is perfect," Henry replied. "The mending, you would hardly know there had been any damage. You have a real skill for it." Theresa's hands paused for just a moment in the wash water. "My mother taught me." She said that taking care of things, mending them properly, was a way of honoring the work that went into making them in the first place. Waste not, want not. "Is she here in Circleville?" Henry asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw Theresa's expression tighten. "She died when I was 17, Theresa said quietly. "Yellow fever. My father followed her 2 years later. He never really recovered from losing her. They had been together since they were young, and when she died, it was like half of him went with her." "I am sorry," Henry said, and meant it. "I lost my parents too, and my sister. It is a hard thing." Theresa looked at him, really looked at him, and Henry had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing more than he usually let people see. "It is," she agreed. "But we keep going, do we not? What else is there to do?" They finished the dishes together, and Henry realized it was the first time in years that he had done something so ordinary with another person. The simple domesticity of it was both comforting and unsettling. When the last dish was put away, Theresa checked his bandage, declared it satisfactory, and reminded him to come to her in the morning so she could change the dressing. Henry went up to his room and lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the murmur of voices from the porch below, the distant yip of coyotes in the hills. He thought about Theresa's careful stitches in the shirt, the way she had mended every tear and reinforced every weak spot. He thought about what she had said about honoring the work that went into making things. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, he dreamed of things he had not let himself think about in years. A house that was his own, a place to come home to, someone waiting who was glad to see him. He woke before dawn feeling unsettled and restless. He dressed quietly and slipped out of the boarding house before anyone else was awake. His horse was stabled at the livery, and he walked there in the gray pre-dawn light. The stable was quiet except for the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls. Henry found his horse, a sturdy bay gelding he had owned for 3 years, and spent some time grooming him and checking his hooves. The familiar routine calmed his mind. This was what he knew, what he was good at. Taking care of his horse, moving from place to place, relying only on himself. "You are up early." Henry turned to find Theresa standing in the stable doorway. She was carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "Could not sleep," Henry said. Theresa came closer and set the basket on a barrel near the door. "I brought you breakfast. I thought you might try to slip away without eating, and that wound needs food to heal properly." Henry felt a flash of irritation at being so easily rayed, followed by embarrassment. "I was not slipping away, just checking on my horse." Theresa's expression was knowing but not unkind. "Of course. Still, you should eat." She uncovered the basket to reveal fresh biscuits, bacon wrapped in a cloth to keep it warm, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. There was also a jar of milk and a small pot of honey. Henry's stomach reminded him that he was hungry despite his emotional turmoil. They sat on hay bales and ate together as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Theresa did not press him with questions or make conversation, and Henry found himself grateful for the comfortable silence. When they finished eating, she stood and checked his bandage, peeling back the edge of his shirt to examine the wound. "It looks good," she said. "No infection. I will change the dressing when we get back to the house." "Why are you doing this?" Henry asked suddenly. "Taking such care with me, I mean. I am just a drifter passing through." Theresa looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes thoughtful. "My father used to say that how we treat strangers says more about us than how we treat friends. Besides, you were hurt and needed help." What kind of person would I be if I turned away someone who needed help? Most people would not have bothered with the shirt, Henry said. They would have just given me an old one and been done with it. Theresa gathered up the basket and the empty dishes. I told you, my mother taught me to honor the work that goes into things. That includes taking care of people properly, not just doing the minimum. Now come back to the house so I can change that bandage before the day gets away from us. They walked back through the awakening town together. A few people were already up, and Henry noticed the greetings they called to Theresa, the way she knew everyone by name. This was her place, where she belonged. The thought made his chest tighten again with that nameless feeling. Back at the boarding house, Theresa changed his bandage in the kitchen while coffee boiled on the stove. Her touch was gentle but professional, and Henry tried not to notice how close she was, the scent of soap and bread that seemed to cling to her. "How long have you been running the boarding house?" Henry asked, partly to distract himself. 2 years since my father died, Theresa said. He started it after my mother passed. I think he needed something to keep him busy, keep his mind occupied. I helped him run it, and when he died, it just made sense to keep going. It is a good living, and I like taking care of people. You do not ever think about doing something else, going somewhere else. Theresa tied off the bandage and stepped back. This is my home. These are my people. Where else would I go? What else would I do? She paused, studying him. You move around a lot, do you not? Never staying anywhere long, Henry nodded. Easier that way. Easier than what? The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to answer, then realized he did not have a good answer. Easier than what? Easier than staying. Easier than letting people get close. Easier than risking caring about someone and losing them like he had lost everyone else. Just easier, he finally said. Theresa's expression was understanding, almost sad. My father was the same way after my mother died. He would take trips to other towns for supplies, stay away for days longer than he needed to. He said he was checking on business opportunities, but I knew he was running. Running from memories, from loneliness, from the empty space she left behind. It did not help him any. The loneliness just followed him wherever he went. Her words struck uncomfortably close to truths Henry had never let himself examine too closely. He stood abruptly, suddenly needing to move, to do something. I should get some air. Thank you for the bandage. He walked out onto the porch and stood looking at the street, his hands gripping the railing. Behind him, he heard Theresa return to the kitchen, the sounds of her preparing for the day continuing without pause. He felt foolish for his reaction, but also exposed, as if she had seen something he had worked very hard to keep hidden. The day passed slowly. Henry spent most of it avoiding the boarding house, walking around the town, talking to people at the general store, watching the blacksmith work. Circleville was a typical small Mormon settlement, he learned, established about 20 years earlier. The people were hardworking. The land was hard but productive if you knew how to work with it. There were a few ranches in the surrounding areas, some farms, and the town served as a stopping point for travelers heading north to Salt Lake City or south toward Arizona Territory. By late afternoon, Henry found himself at the edge of town, looking out over the valley. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks catching the late sun. It was beautiful country, he had to admit, harsh but beautiful. The kind of place a person could build something lasting if they had a mind to. The thought surprised him. He had spent so many years just drifting that the idea of building something, of staying somewhere, felt foreign. But there was something about this place, or maybe something about the woman who had mended his shirt with such care, that made him wonder if he had been running for so long that he had forgotten what he was running toward. He returned to the boarding house as the sun was setting. Dinner was the same gathering as the night before, with the addition of a couple who were passing through on their way to visit family in Beaver. The conversation was lively, and Henry found himself contributing more than usual, telling a story about a wild horse he had once spent 3 weeks tracking and finally taming. After dinner, he helped Theresa with the dishes again. This time, she told him about some of the more colorful characters who had stayed at the boarding house over the years. There was the traveling actor who had paid for his room by performing Shakespeare in the parlor. The prospector who claimed he had found gold and was going to return to buy the whole town, who they had never seen again. The young couple eloping who had been so nervous they could barely eat their wedding supper. "You have met a lot of interesting people," Henry observed. "I have," Theresa agreed. "It is one of the things I love about running this place. Every person has a story if you take the time to listen. What about you? You must have stories from all your traveling." Henry considered this as he dried a plate. "I suppose I do. Mostly stories about cattle and horses, about weather and trails. Nothing very exciting." "I think you are selling yourself short," Theresa said. "You survived a gunfight with rustlers. That is more excitement than most people see in a lifetime." "It is not the kind of excitement I would recommend," Henry said dryly, and Theresa laughed. The sound of her laughter did something strange to Henry's chest, made it feel both tight and warm at the same time. He found himself wanting to say things that would make her laugh again, wanting to see the way her eyes lit up, and the smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to something that caught his breath. That night, lying in bed, Henry had to admit to himself that he was in trouble. He had only been in Circleville for 2 days, and already he was thinking about staying longer, about reasons he could invent to extend his visit. It was foolish. He barely knew Theresa. She was kind to him because she was a kind person, because she ran a boarding house and taking care of guests was what she did. There was nothing special about the attention she showed him. Except there was something special about the way she had mended his shirt, taking time and care with every stitch. Something special about the way she had brought him breakfast at the stable, understanding without being told that he was feeling overwhelmed. Something special about the comfortable silences they shared while washing dishes, the easy conversation that flowed between them. Henry had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to connect with another person, to want to be near someone for reasons that had nothing to do with practicality or survival. The feeling was both wonderful and terrifying. The next morning, he came down to find Theresa in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The other guests were still asleep or just beginning to stir. Without thinking about it, Henry started helping, setting the table in the dining room, filling water glasses, putting out butter and jam. Theresa gave him an appraising look but said nothing, just nodded her thanks. When the other guests came down, breakfast was ready, and they all sat together. Robert the salesman announced he would be leaving that morning, heading north to the next town on his route. The ranch hands said they needed to get back to their spread, as there was fence work that needed doing before winter. Martha and her son were also leaving, as their house was finally ready to move back into. By mid-morning, the boarding house was suddenly much quieter. The rooms were empty except for Ernest the schoolteacher, who kept a permanent room there as he had no family and preferred not to maintain his own house, and Henry. Theresa went about her work with her usual efficiency, but Henry noticed she seemed quieter than usual. "You will have the place to yourself for a bit," she said as she changed his bandage. The wound was healing well, the edges already beginning to close. It happens sometimes. Everyone leaves at once, then within a few days the rooms fill up again. People traveling through, families visiting, workers passing through looking for seasonal jobs. Does it bother you, the quiet I mean? Henry asked. Theresa considered the question. Sometimes. The house feels too big when it is empty. But it also gives me time to catch up on things that are hard to do when the rooms are full. Deeper cleaning, repairs, preserving food for winter. There is always something that needs doing. I could help, Henry offered before he could think better of it. I have some carpentry skills, and I notice there are a few things around here that could use attention. The step on the front porch is loose, and the gate on the chicken coop has a broken hinge. Theresa looked at him in surprise. You are a guest. You are supposed to be resting and recovering, not working. My shoulder is healing well, thanks to you. I can do light work. Besides, I owe you for the care you have taken with me. The least I can do is make some repairs. You do not owe me anything, Theresa said firmly. I did what anyone would do. But not everyone would do it as well as you did, Henry countered. Please, let me help. I am not used to sitting idle, and if I have to spend another day just wandering around town, I will go crazy. Theresa studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, if you insist. But nothing too strenuous, and if your shoulder starts hurting, you stop immediately. Agreed, agreed, Henry said, feeling unreasonably pleased. He spent the rest of the morning making small repairs around the boarding house. The loose step was quickly fixed with a few nails. The chicken coop hinge required a trip to the blacksmith for a replacement, which gave Henry a chance to have a good conversation with the smith, a man named Daniel who proved to be knowledgeable and friendly. By afternoon, Henry was working on a window frame that had swelled and was sticking, carefully planing down the wood until it opened and closed smoothly. Theresa brought him lemonade and watched him work for a few minutes. You are good at this, she observed. Did you learn carpentry from your father? Some, Henry said, testing the window. He was a rancher, but he could turn his hand to most things. You had to be able to do everything yourself when you lived remote like we did. I picked up more over the years, working different places. You learn what you need to learn to get by. It is more than just getting by, Theresa said. You care about doing it right. I can see that. Henry felt heat rise to his face at the compliment. Well, you showed me how important it is to do things properly when you mended my shirt. Seemed only fair to return the favor. He glanced at her and found her looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding or recognition that made his heart speed up. Then Theresa looked away, color rising in her own cheeks. I should start preparing dinner, she said, and hurried back to the house. Henry stood there for a moment, the planing tool still in his hand, trying to understand what had just happened. Then he shook his head and returned to his work. But his thoughts kept drifting back to that moment, that look. That evening, with just the three of them for dinner, the conversation was more intimate, less performative than it had been with a full table. Ernest told stories about his students, clearly devoted to his work despite the challenges. Theresa talked about her plans for the boarding house, small improvements she wanted to make, her hopes for the future. Henry found himself talking about his travels, but for the first time in years, he talked about the loneliness of it too, the way it felt to never quite belong anywhere. Why do you do it then? Ernest asked gently. If it makes you lonely, why keep moving? Henry was quiet for a long moment. I suppose I never really thought about stopping. After my family died, I was just surviving day to day, moving from job to job, and after a while that became the only thing I knew how to do, the only thing that felt safe. Safe from what? Theresa asked softly. Safe from losing anyone else, Henry admitted. The words came out before he could stop them, and he immediately wished he could take them back. But both Ernest and Theresa just nodded, understanding in their eyes. But you are losing something by not staying, Ernest said. You are losing the chance to build something, to be part of something larger than yourself. We all face loss in this life. It is inevitable. But that does not mean we should stop living, stop connecting with others. If anything, it means we should cherish those connections all the more. The words settled over Henry like a weight, or maybe like a revelation. He thought about the shirt Theresa had mended, how she could have just given him an old shirt and been done with it, but instead had taken the time to carefully repair every tear. Maybe life was like that. Maybe the tears and the broken places were not reasons to throw things away, but opportunities to mend them, to make them stronger. That night, he did not go straight to his room after helping with the dishes. Instead, he sat on the porch with Theresa, watching the stars come out. The night was cool, and she had wrapped herself in a shawl. They did not talk much, just sat in comfortable silence, but Henry was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the sound of her breathing, the occasional movement as she adjusted her shawl. "I am glad you stayed," Theresa said suddenly, quietly. "I know you probably have places to be, things to do, but I am glad you did not just pass through." Henry's heart was beating hard against his ribs. "I am glad too," he said, "more glad than I probably should be." Theresa turned to look at him, and in the moonlight her eyes were dark and soft. "Why should you not be glad?" "Because I am not the staying kind," Henry said, forcing himself to be honest. "I have been running for so long, I am not sure I know how to stop. And you deserve someone who can stay, someone who can put down roots and build something lasting." "Maybe," Theresa said slowly, "but maybe what I need is someone who understands loss, who knows what it is like to be alone. Someone who can appreciate the value of mending what is broken instead of just throwing it away and starting over." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Henry wanted to reach for her hand, wanted to tell her that she had already started mending something in him, something he had not even realized was broken. But the words stuck in his throat, too big and too frightening to say out loud. They sat there a while longer, then Theresa stood. "Good night, Henry," she said softly. "Thank you for helping today. It meant more than you know." She went inside, leaving Henry alone with the stars and his tumbling thoughts. He sat there for a long time, wrestling with fears and hopes that felt too large to contain. Finally, he went up to his room, but sleep was a long time coming. The next few days fell into a pattern that felt both natural and dangerously comfortable. Henry would wake early and help Theresa with breakfast. After the meal, he would spend the morning and early afternoon working on various repairs around the boarding house and the surrounding buildings. Theresa would bring him lunch, and they would eat together, talking about everything and nothing. In the afternoons, he would sometimes help in the kitchen, learning recipes his mother had never taught him, or he would work in the garden, preparing it for winter. Evenings were spent on the porch, talking quietly while the sky darkened and the stars emerged. Henry's shoulder healed rapidly under Theresa's attentive care. Within a week, it was barely more than a pink line on his skin, and he had full range of motion back. He knew he should think about moving on, about the winter coming and the need to find work somewhere before the snow made travel difficult. But every time he thought about saddling his horse and riding away from Circleville, his chest tightened with something that felt like panic. Theresa never asked him to stay, never pressed him about his plans. But he saw the way she looked at him sometimes when she thought he was not watching, and he recognized the longing there because it matched what he felt. They were circling around each other, around feelings neither of them quite dared to name. One morning, about 10 days after Henry had first arrived, a family showed up at the boarding house. A man and woman with 3 children, the youngest barely walking. They were traveling to Salt Lake City, the man said, looking for work after their farm had failed. They looked exhausted and worn, their clothes patched and repatched, their few belongings tied up in bundles. Theresa welcomed them in without hesitation, even though Henry could see her quick calculation that they likely did not have much money. She served them a hot meal, gave them the best family room in the house, and when the man tried to pay her, she named a price that was less than half what she usually charged. "You have children," she said simply when the man protested. "They need good food and rest. Pay me what you can and we will call it square." After the family had gone upstairs to rest, Henry found Theresa in the kitchen, preparing yet more food. "You barely charge them anything," he said. "They barely have anything," Theresa replied. "What was I supposed to do, turn them away? Let them camp in the cold with 3 small children?" "No," Henry said, "but you cannot run a business giving away rooms and food." Theresa turned to face him, her expression fierce. "This is not just a business. This is people's lives. That man is desperate for work, trying to keep his family fed and safe. His wife is exhausted from caring for 3 children while traveling. If I can give them a warm bed and hot food for a few days, help them get to where they are going with a little strength left, then that is what I am going to do. I would rather go broke helping people than get rich turning them away." Henry stared at her, feeling something shift fundamentally in his chest. This woman with her careful mending and her fierce compassion, who saw people not as transactions but as human beings deserving of care, had somehow worked her way into his heart without him noticing. Or maybe he had noticed and had been too afraid to admit it. "You are an extraordinary person, Theresa Norwood," he said quietly. Theresa's fierce expression softened. "I am just doing what is right, what my parents taught me to do." "It is more than that," Henry insisted. "Plenty of people know what is right and do not do it. You do. Every time, without hesitation. You did it for me when I showed up bleeding and torn. You are doing it for that family. It is who you are, down to your bones." Theresa's eyes were suddenly bright with unshed tears. "Then why does it feel so hard sometimes? Why do I feel so alone, even when the house is full of people?" The raw honesty of her words broke something open in Henry. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands in his. "Because taking care of everyone else does not mean you get taken care of," he said. "Because you can surround yourself with people and still be lonely if none of them really see you." "You see me," Theresa whispered. "Yes," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. "I see you. I see your strength and your kindness. I see how you mend things that are broken and honor the work that goes into living. I see you, Theresa, and you are the most remarkable woman I have ever met." A tear slipped down Theresa's cheek, and Henry reached up without thinking and brushed it away with his thumb. The touch was electric, and suddenly they were standing so close he could feel the warmth of her breath, see the flecks of darker gray in her eyes. His heart was hammering so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Henry," she said, and his name on her lips was a question and an answer all at once. He leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but she did not move. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a question being asked and answered. Then Theresa's hands came up to his chest, fingers curling into his shirt, the shirt she had mended with such care, and the kiss deepened. Henry wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and felt something in him finally settle, finally find its home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Theresa rested her forehead against his chest. Henry could feel her heart racing as fast as his own. "I was not supposed to fall in love with you," she said softly. "You are leaving. You always leave." "I do not want to leave," Henry said, the words coming from somewhere deep and true. "I do not want to leave you. I think maybe you have been mending more than my shirt. I think you have been mending me, piece by piece, and I did not even realize how broken I was until you started putting me back together." Theresa looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "What are you saying?" Henry took a deep breath, stepping off a cliff he had been avoiding for years. "I am saying I want to stay, if you will have me. I am saying that I think I have been running from loneliness for so long that I forgot loneliness is not something you run from. It is something you end by finding someone worth staying for. And you, Theresa Norwood, you are worth staying for. You are worth everything." Fresh tears spilled down Theresa's cheeks, but she was smiling. "You want to stay in Circleville, give up traveling." "I want to stay with you," Henry corrected. "I do not care if it is Circleville or anywhere else. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to help you run this boarding house. I want to mend fence posts and fix stuck windows and wash dishes with you every night. I want to build a life with you if you will let me." Theresa laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will let you. I will more than let you. I want that too. I have been so lonely for so long, and then you showed up with your torn shirt and your wounded shoulder and your carefully guarded heart, and you saw me. Really saw me. How could I not fall in love with you?" They kissed again, longer and deeper, pouring years of loneliness and longing into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, they were both laughing and crying at the same time. Henry felt lighter than he had in years, as if a burden he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten it was there had suddenly been lifted. The sound of children's laughter from upstairs reminded them they were not alone. Theresa wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself, but she could not stop smiling. Henry kept hold of her hand, unwilling to let go. "We should probably talk about the practical things," Theresa said, but her tone suggested she did not really care about practical things at the moment. "About how this will work, about what you will do." "I have money saved from the cattle sale," Henry said. "Not a lot, but enough to contribute, and I can work. There is always work for someone willing to do it, or I could help you here with the boarding house. Whatever you need." "What I need is you," Theresa said simply. "The rest we can figure out as we go." Over the next few days, Henry and Theresa began building their future together. They told Ernest first, who smiled with genuine pleasure and clapped Henry on the shoulder, saying he had wondered how long it would take the two of them to figure out what everyone else had already seen. They told the traveling family, who congratulated them warmly. The mother squeezed Theresa's hand and said she could see the happiness glowing from her. Henry moved his few possessions from the guest room to Theresa's private room at the back of the first floor. It felt momentous and terrifying and absolutely right. That first night, lying in bed with Theresa in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder, Henry marveled at how his life had changed in less than 2 weeks. He had ridden into Circleville expecting to sell some cattle, rest for a day or two, and move on as he always did. Instead, he had found home. "What are you thinking?" Theresa murmured sleepily. "That I almost missed this," Henry said honestly. "If those rustlers had not shot me, if my shirt had not been torn, I might have just passed through and never stopped long enough to really see this place. To see you." Theresa propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the lamplight. "Then I suppose I should be grateful to those rustlers, as strange as that sounds, though I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are meant to be." "You really believe that?" Henry asked. "I do," Theresa said firmly. "I believe that every tear and every mending, every loss and every finding leads us to where we are supposed to be. You traveled all over, searching for something you could not name. I stayed here, waiting for something I did not know I was missing. And then you showed up, and everything made sense." Henry pulled her down for a kiss that said everything his words could not quite capture. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies and hearts. Afterward, holding her close, Henry felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. The restlessness that had driven him for so long was gone, replaced by a certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. In the morning, they got up and made breakfast together, moving around each other in the kitchen with an ease that felt like they had been doing it for years instead of days. The traveling family came down, preparing to continue their journey. Henry surprised them by giving them some of his money, enough to help them get established once they reached Salt Lake City. "You do not have to do that," the man protested, but Henry could see the relief in his eyes. "I know," Henry said. "But someone helped me when I needed it, and this is my way of passing that on. Take care of your family, find good work, build a good life." After the family left, Henry and Theresa sat on the porch, watching the morning sun climb higher in the sky. "You gave them a lot of money," Theresa observed. "I have enough," Henry said. "And I have something more valuable than money now. I have you. I have a home. What good is money sitting in my pocket compared to helping a family that needs it?" Theresa leaned her head on his shoulder. "You are going to fit in perfectly here," she said. "Taking care of people, making sure everyone is looked after. We will make a good team." They did make a good team. As the weeks passed and fall deepened into early winter, Henry and Theresa settled into running the boarding house together. New guests arrived, people passing through or staying for longer periods. Word spread quickly that Henry and Theresa were a couple, and the townspeople accepted him readily. Several local ranchers approached him about work, and he took on odd jobs when the boarding house was quiet, bringing in additional income and building a reputation as someone reliable and skilled. In late November, when the first snow was dusting the mountain peaks, Henry proposed officially. He had bought a simple gold band from a jeweler in Beaver during a supply run, and he knelt in front of Theresa in the kitchen where they had first really talked, where she had mended his shirt, and without knowing it, begun mending his heart. "I know we have only known each other a few months," Henry said, the ring trembling slightly in his hand. "But I am more certain of this than I have ever been of anything. Will you marry me, Theresa? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how much I love you?" Theresa said yes through happy tears, and the ring slipped onto her finger as if it had been made for her. They set the date for early December, wanting to be married before the winter set in too hard. The whole town helped prepare for the wedding. Martha, whose house was finished and who remained a close friend, helped Theresa make her dress. Ernest arranged for his cousin, a traveling preacher, to come perform the ceremony. Daniel the blacksmith and his wife hosted the reception in their barn, which was decorated with evergreen boughs and candles. The wedding day dawned cold and clear. Henry stood at the front of the small church, his heart pounding as he watched Theresa walk down the aisle. She wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, practical but beautiful, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, and she carried a small bouquet of dried flowers preserved from the fall. She looked radiant, and Henry felt his eyes sting with tears as she took his hand. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the preacher asked if they promised to love and cherish each other through all the joys and sorrows of life, through sickness and health, through abundance and want, they both answered with clear, firm voices. The vows felt like more than just words. They felt like a promise to keep mending each other, to honor the work of building a life together, to never again face loneliness alone. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Henry kissed Theresa with a joy he had never imagined he would feel. The small church erupted in cheers and applause, and they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, facing their future as a united pair. The reception was a joyful affair with music and dancing, more food than seemed possible, and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to humorous. Henry found himself surrounded by people he was beginning to think of as friends, as community. These were his people now, and this was his place. The realization filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the whiskey being passed around. Late in the evening, as the party was winding down, Henry and Theresa slipped away back to the boarding house. They stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the home they would now share fully as husband and wife. "Are you happy?" Theresa asked softly. Henry pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. "I did not know I could be this happy," he said honestly. "I spent so many years running from everything, from everyone, convinced that loneliness was just the price of living. And then you mended my shirt, and somehow you mended me too. You showed me that the broken places are not permanent, that with care and patience and love, anything can be repaired." Theresa looked up at him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "We mended each other," she corrected gently. "You showed me that I did not have to be strong and capable all by myself, that letting someone see my loneliness, my need, was not a weakness but a strength. We saved each other, Henry." They went inside together, closing the door against the cold December night. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges and joys awaited them, they would face it together. The cowboy who had been running for so long had finally found his home, not in a place but in a person. And the woman who had spent years taking care of everyone else had finally found someone who would take care of her in return. The first winter of their marriage was cold but happy. The boarding house stayed busy, with people seeking shelter from the harsh weather. Henry worked alongside Theresa, learning the rhythms of her life and adding his own to them. He took over much of the heavy work, the repairs and maintenance, freeing Theresa to focus on the cooking and the careful attention to guests that made her boarding house special. In the evenings, after the guests had retired and the dishes were washed and put away, they would sit by the fire in their private room. Sometimes they would read aloud to each other. Sometimes they would just talk about their days, their dreams, their plans for the future. And sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, each working on their own tasks. Theresa would often be mending something, her needle flashing in the firelight as she repaired torn clothes or worn linens. Henry would watch her hands move with practiced precision, still marveling at the care she took with each stitch. "I am going to need more mending to do soon," Theresa said one evening in late winter, a smile playing at her lips. Henry looked up from the harness he was oiling. "Why is that?" "Because we are going to have a baby," Theresa said, her voice filled with quiet joy. "Come summer, we will be 3 instead of 2. Henry's hands stilled on the leather. For a moment he could not speak, could not breathe. Then he crossed to where Theresa sat and knelt beside her chair, his hands covering hers. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby," Theresa nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Are you happy?" "I know we have not been married very long, and I know there is a lot to figure out, but I am so happy, Henry, so very happy." Henry pulled her into his arms, feeling his own tears come. "I am happier than I have words for," he managed. "A baby, our baby. Theresa, I love you so much." They held each other for a long time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this new development. A baby would change everything, Henry knew. There would be less sleep, more work, more worry. But there would also be more joy, more love, more reasons to keep building the life they were creating together. The months that followed were busy ones. They prepared a room for the baby, turning a small storage space off their bedroom into a nursery. Henry built a cradle with his own hands, carefully sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk. Theresa sewed blankets and tiny clothes, her face glowing with anticipation. Word spread through Circleville, and the community rallied around them. Martha brought baby clothes her own children had outgrown. Daniel's wife shared wisdom about childbirth and caring for newborns. Ernest, who had no family of his own, quietly left a savings bond for the baby's future education. The outpouring of support touched both Henry and Theresa deeply. In early July, on a hot summer day when the air shimmered with heat, Theresa went into labor. Henry sent for Martha, who had helped deliver half the babies in Circleville, and tried not to panic as Theresa's contractions grew stronger. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the afternoon and into the night. Henry stayed by Theresa's side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, feeling helpless and terrified. Finally, just before dawn, a baby's cry filled the room. Henry looked up to see Martha holding a small, red, absolutely perfect infant. "You have a son," Martha said, smiling through her own tears as she handed the baby to Theresa. "A son." Henry stared at the tiny person cradled in Theresa's arms, awed by the impossibility of it. This was his child, his and Theresa's, a whole new person who existed because they loved each other. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that squinted against the lamplight. His tiny hands waved in the air, and when Henry gently offered his finger, the baby grasped it with surprising strength. "Hello, little one," Theresa whispered, her voice exhausted but radiant. "Welcome to the world." They named him James Edward Morrison, after Henry's father and Theresa's father. Little Jamie, as they called him, was a healthy, hungry baby who quickly became the center of their universe. The boarding house adjusted to accommodate the new arrival. Guests cooed over the baby, and some of the women offered to hold him so Theresa could get other work done. Henry discovered reserves of gentleness he had not known he possessed, learning to change diapers and soothe the baby's cries. Being a father changed something fundamental in Henry. He had thought he understood love, had thought his feelings for Theresa were the deepest he could experience. But holding his son, watching him sleep, seeing his tiny features gradually resolve into a unique little person, opened new depths of emotion. This was what he had been running from all those years, he realized. Not the loss itself, but the fear of feeling this much, of having something so precious that losing it would destroy him. But watching Theresa with their son, seeing the family they were building together, Henry understood that the risk was worth it. That love was always worth the risk. That being part of something larger than yourself, being connected to others in ways that made you vulnerable, was not a weakness but the greatest strength of all. As Jamie grew from infant to toddler, the boarding house continued to thrive. Henry had become known throughout the area as someone reliable and skilled, and he took on more substantial projects. He helped build a new barn for one of the ranchers, repaired the church steeple after a windstorm damaged it, and even assisted in constructing a small schoolhouse in a nearby settlement. The work brought in good money and gave him a reputation that brought more work. Theresa managed the boarding house with the same care and attention she always had, though now with Jamie often strapped to her back or playing in a safe corner of the kitchen. Guests delighted in the happy family atmosphere, and word spread that the Norwood boarding house, now often called the Morrison boarding house, was one of the best places to stay in southern Utah Territory. When Jamie was 2 years old, Theresa became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and the labor, while still difficult, was shorter. They welcomed a daughter in the spring of 1881, a tiny girl with Theresa's gray eyes and Henry's dark hair. They named her Sarah Grace, after Theresa's mother and for the grace that had brought them together. With 2 young children, the boarding house required even more juggling, but Martha had become like a grandmother to the children and often helped watch them. Ernest read to them and taught Jamie his letters. Daniel's wife shared her own children's outgrown toys and clothes. The community that had welcomed Henry now embraced his growing family. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both busy and deeply satisfying. Henry would rise early to help with breakfast and handle any urgent repairs. He would spend the morning working on whatever project he had taken on, whether at the boarding house or elsewhere in town. Midday, he would return for lunch and spend time with the children. Afternoons were for lighter work, playing with Jamie and Sarah, helping Theresa with the never-ending tasks of running a boarding house. Evenings were for family, for putting the children to bed, and then sitting with Theresa, talking about their day, making plans for the future. The years passed quickly, measured in the children's milestones. Jamie's first day of school, Sarah's first steps, Jamie learning to help his father with simple repairs, Sarah following her mother around the kitchen, standing on a stool to help knead bread. The boarding house saw a constant flow of people, each with their own stories, their own joys and sorrows. Henry and Theresa welcomed them all, provided shelter and sustenance, and sent them on their way better for having stayed. In 1884, when Jamie was 6 and Sarah was 3, Theresa became pregnant a third time. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and Henry worried constantly. But in the fall, they welcomed twin boys, identical little things who looked at the world with serious blue eyes. They named them Thomas and Robert, and suddenly their household felt very full indeed. 4 children meant even more work, but it also meant more laughter, more chaos, more life. The boarding house adapted. Some rooms were permanently set aside for the family. Henry built additions to accommodate their growing needs. And through it all, the community continued to support them, to be part of their extended family. Henry sometimes thought back to the lonely cowboy who had ridden into Circleville all those years ago, wounded and weary, convinced that solitude was safer than connection. That man seemed like a stranger now. In his place was someone who knew the value of belonging, who understood that strength came not from isolation, but from the ties that bound people together. One evening, when the twins were about a year old, Henry stood on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sun set over the mountains. It had been a long day, and he was tired in a way that went bone deep. But it was a good tired, the tiredness of a day well spent in service of people he loved. Theresa came out and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Henry squeezed her hand. "I was thinking about the day we met, about my torn shirt and how you could have just given me an old one and sent me on my way. But instead, you mended it with such care, and somehow you mended me too." Theresa leaned her head against his shoulder. "We mended each other. We are still mending each other every day. That is what love is, I think. Constantly tending to the tears and the worn places, reinforcing what needs support, taking care of what matters." "You are very wise, Mrs. Morrison," Henry said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I had a good teacher," Theresa replied. "My mother always said that how we care for things shows what we value, and I value you, Henry Morrison. I value our life together, our children, our home. Every stitch, every repair, every moment of care is an act of love." From inside the house came the sound of children laughing, a crash as something fell, Jamie calling out that he had not done it. Theresa and Henry looked at each other and smiled. "I should go see what that was," Theresa said, but she did not move immediately. "Probably nothing important," Henry said. "And if it is, we will fix it. We always do." They stood there a moment longer, holding hands, watching the last light fade from the sky. Then they went inside together, back to the beautiful chaos of their life, back to the family they had built from loneliness and loss, and the simple act of caring enough to mend what was broken. The years continued to unfold, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. Jamie grew tall and serious, inheriting his father's skill with tools and his mother's thoughtful nature. Sarah became a sweet-tempered helper, always ready to tend to her younger brothers or help a guest who needed something. The twins, Thomas and Robert, were inseparable and mischievous, keeping everyone on their toes. When Utah achieved statehood in 1896, Circleville celebrated with a big festival. Henry and Theresa, now in their 40s, stood with their children and watched the parades and listened to the speeches. They had been part of this community for nearly 20 years, had helped it grow and change. The boarding house was now an institution, a place people thought of when they thought of Circleville. As the children grew older and began to make their own ways in the world, Henry and Theresa found themselves with more time to spend together. Jamie took over many of the heavy repairs, showing a talent that matched his father's. Sarah began helping more extensively with the boarding house, learning her mother's recipes and her careful attention to guests. The twins were still young, but already showing signs of their own interests and talents. One evening, Henry found the old blue shirt that Theresa had mended for him so many years ago. It was carefully folded in a trunk with other things they had saved, mementos of their life together. He held it up and examined Theresa's careful stitches, still holding strong after all these years. Theresa came into the room and saw what he was holding. "I cannot believe that old shirt has lasted this long," she said. "It is held together by your stitches," Henry replied. "Just like I am held together by your love. This shirt is a reminder of where we started, of how we found each other." Theresa came to stand beside him, running her fingers over the old fabric. "I remember the day you showed up. You looked so lost, so alone, even though you were trying hard not to show it. I remember thinking that you needed more than just a mended shirt. You needed someone to see you, to care about you. And you did," Henry said. "You saw me when I had forgotten how to let myself be seen. You cared for me when I had convinced myself I did not need anyone. You saved my life, Theresa. Not just by tending my wound, but by showing me that there was a different way to live." "We saved each other," Theresa said, echoing words she had spoken before. "I was just as lonely as you were, just better at hiding it, taking care of everyone else so I did not have to face my own emptiness. And then you showed up and filled that emptiness with love and partnership and all these beautiful years together." Henry carefully folded the shirt and put it back in the trunk. "Do you ever regret it, the life we have built?" "Sometimes I think about how much work it is, how challenging the children can be, how the boarding house always needs something. Do you ever wish you had chosen something easier?" Theresa turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "Never, not once. This life we have built, with all its challenges and work and chaos, is exactly what I was meant for. You are what I was meant for. Our children, our home, our community, all of it. I would not change a single thing." They kissed then, a kiss that held nearly 2 decades of love and partnership, of joys shared and sorrows weathered together. When they broke apart, Henry felt a profound gratitude for the path his life had taken, for the bullet that had torn his shirt and led him to this woman, this life. As the 20th century approached, bringing with it changes that would transform the American West, Henry and Theresa Morrison stood firm in Circleville, rooted in the life they had built together. The boarding house continued to welcome travelers and provide a place of rest and renewal. Their children grew and thrived, each finding their own path, but all staying close to home, drawn by the example their parents had set of love and service and community. On their 20th wedding anniversary in late 1899, the town threw a celebration in their honor. Speeches were made about their contributions to Circleville, about the people they had helped over the years, about the example they set of what marriage and partnership could be. Henry and Theresa stood together, embarrassed by the attention but touched by the love and respect of their community. When Henry was called on to speak, he stood holding Theresa's hand and looked out at the crowd of friends and neighbors. "I do not have any grand wisdom to share," he said. "I can only tell you what I learned from this remarkable woman beside me. She taught me that broken things can be mended, that taking care of something properly is an act of love and respect, that we are stronger together than we ever could be alone. 20 years ago, I rode into this town with a torn shirt and a wounded heart, convinced that loneliness was just my fate. But Theresa saw something worth saving, and she mended not just my shirt but my whole life. She gave me a home, a family, a purpose. She gave me herself, and that has made all the difference." The crowd applauded, and Theresa wiped tears from her eyes. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and said simply, "Love is not just a feeling. It is an action. It is the choice to care for someone every day, to mend what is broken, to strengthen what is weak, to honor what is precious. Henry and I have been mending each other for 20 years. I hope we have many more years to continue the work." The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Henry and Theresa danced together under the stars, moving to the rhythm of the fiddles and guitars, surrounded by the people they loved. Their children danced nearby, and Henry caught Jamie's eye and saw his son smile with genuine happiness. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Henry and Theresa walked back to the boarding house hand in hand. The building was dark and quiet, all their guests having gone to the celebration or already retired for the night. They stood for a moment in the front yard, looking up at the house that had been the center of their life together. "Thank you," Henry said quietly. "For what?" Theresa asked. "For mending my shirt that day, for seeing past the torn fabric to the man beneath, for choosing to love me every day since then, for building this life with me, for everything." Theresa squeezed his hand. "Thank you for staying, for choosing to stop running, for trusting me with your wounded heart, for being the partner I needed, the father our children needed, the man this community needed. Thank you for choosing me, choosing us, choosing this life." They went inside together, climbing the stairs to their room. The house was peaceful, and Henry felt a contentment that went soul deep. Tomorrow there would be work to do, guests to care for, repairs to make, meals to cook, children to tend. There would be challenges and probably some heartaches, because that was the nature of life. But there would also be love and laughter, and the profound satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and connection. As he drifted off to sleep with Theresa in his arms, Henry thought once more about that torn shirt, about the bullet that had grazed him and sent him seeking help in a small Utah town. What had seemed like bad luck at the time had been the best thing that ever happened to him. That torn shirt had been a doorway to everything that mattered, to love and family and home. And Theresa's careful stitches, her patient mending, had held strong through all the years, just as their love had held strong through everything life had thrown at them. The cowboy who had been running from loneliness had finally found peace, had finally understood that the cure for loneliness was not isolation but connection, not walls but open doors, not independence but interdependence. He had found it all in a woman with gray eyes and gentle hands, a woman who saw mending not as a chore but as an act of love, who understood that caring for things properly was how you built a life that mattered. She had repaired his torn shirt, and in doing so, she had mended the loneliness in his soul. And he had spent every day since trying to be worthy of that gift, trying to mend and care for her in return. Years continued to pass in the familiar pattern of seasonal change and family milestones. By 1905, Jamie had married a local girl and was working as a carpenter, having learned his skills from Henry. They lived in a house Henry had helped build, just down the street from the boarding house. Sarah married a teacher who had come to town and fallen in love with both the place and the young woman who helped run the boarding house. The twins, now young men, were preparing to take over more of the boarding house operations, showing a natural talent for hospitality and business. Henry and Theresa found themselves becoming grandparents, a role they embraced with joy. Jamie's wife gave birth to a daughter, then a son. Sarah had twin girls, causing much amusement about how twins seemed to run in the Morrison family. Each new grandchild was a miracle, a continuation of the love that Henry and Theresa had built together. The boarding house remained successful, though Henry and Theresa gradually handed over more responsibilities to Thomas and Robert. They still worked every day, still welcomed guests and oversaw operations, but with less of the constant physical labor. Henry's hair had gone gray, and his hands showed the wear of decades of hard work, but he was healthy and strong. Theresa's hair also showed silver threads, and lines had formed around her eyes and mouth. But to Henry, she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her. They took more time for themselves now, going on walks in the evenings, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, visiting with their children and grandchildren. These moments of peace and connection were precious, earned through years of hard work and devotion. One spring day in 1910, when Henry was 58 and Theresa was 55, they decided to take a trip. It was something they had rarely done, as the boarding house had always required their presence. But with Thomas and Robert fully capable of managing things, and with their other children nearby to help if needed, they packed a bag and set out in a small wagon. They traveled through southern Utah, visiting places Henry had passed through in his wandering years but had never really seen. They camped under the stars, cooked over open fires, and talked about everything and nothing. It was like being young again, Henry thought, except better because they knew each other so well, understood each other so completely. One evening, camped in a valley with red cliffs rising on all sides, Henry and Theresa sat by their fire watching the stars emerge. Henry thought about the cowboy he had been, wounded and alone, riding into Circleville with no idea that his life was about to change forever. "Do you remember the first time we sat together in the evening?" Henry asked. "On the porch of the boarding house just a few days after we met," Theresa smiled. "I remember. You were all tense and uncomfortable, like you were not sure whether to run away or stay." "I felt like you could see right through me," Henry admitted. "Like you knew all the things I was trying to hide. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time." "I did see through you," Theresa said softly. "I saw a man who was lonely and hurt but trying so hard to pretend he did not need anyone. I saw someone worth knowing, worth caring for, worth loving. And I was right." Henry reached over and took her hand, her fingers fitting perfectly between his as they had for more than 30 years. "You were right, about everything. About us, about what we could build together, about how love is an action, not just a feeling. You taught me how to live, Theresa, really live, not just survive." "We taught each other," Theresa said. "That is what partnership is. Teaching each other, learning from each other, growing together. I am grateful for every day we have had, every challenge we faced, every joy we shared. You are my home, Henry Morrison. Not the boarding house, not Circleville, but you. Wherever you are is where I belong." They made love that night under the stars, their bodies older but their passion no less real. Afterward, Lying wrapped in blankets with Theresa in his arms, Henry felt a profound peace. Whatever time they had left, whether years or decades, he would spend it loving this woman, caring for their family, serving their community. It was a good life, a life worth living, a life that mattered. They returned to Circleville after 2 weeks, refreshed and reconnected. The boarding house had run smoothly in their absence, proof that they had built something lasting, something that would continue even after they were gone. Thomas and Robert had handled every challenge that arose, and both expressed surprise at how much work their parents had been doing all these years. "You made it look easy," Thomas said, "but it is not easy at all." "Nothing worth doing is easy," Henry replied, "but it is worth it. You will learn that as you go." Life continued in its pleasant rhythm. More grandchildren arrived, and Henry and Theresa delighted in being part of their growing up. The children loved spending time at the boarding house, helping with small tasks, hearing stories from the guests who came through. It was an education in humanity, in kindness, in the wide world beyond their small town. In 1915, as the world beyond Utah Territory was sliding toward a great war, Circleville remained mostly peaceful. The boarding house celebrated its 35th year of operation, having provided shelter and sustenance to thousands of people over the decades. A local newspaper ran a story about Henry and Theresa, calling them pillars of the community and examples of what dedication and love could build. Henry was 63 now, still strong but feeling his age. Theresa was 60, her hair completely silver but her energy undiminished. They had been married 33 years, had built a family and a business and a legacy that would outlast them. When Henry thought about his life, he felt no regrets, only gratitude. One evening, as they sat on the porch in their customary spot, Theresa suddenly said, "Do you remember what I told you about my father? How after my mother died he would run away, take trips to escape his loneliness?" "I remember," Henry said. "I never told you how he finally found peace," Theresa continued. "It was not until just before he died. He told me that he finally understood that he was not supposed to run from the memories, the loneliness, the loss. He was supposed to embrace it, to let it be part of him, to honor my mother by living fully even though she was gone. He said he wasted so many years running when he should have been living." "Why are you telling me this now?" Henry asked gently. Theresa turned to look at him, her eyes serious. "Because I want you to know that you did the opposite. When you stopped in Circleville, when you chose to stay, you chose to live instead of run. You honored your losses by building something new, something good. You did not let loneliness win, and I am so proud of you for that." Henry felt tears prick his eyes. "I could not have done it without you. You showed me how." "We did it together," Theresa said, "just like everything else." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple and red. The evening was peaceful, the air cooling as night approached. From inside the boarding house came the sounds of dinner being prepared, of guests gathering, of life continuing in its endless cycle. Henry thought about the shirt Theresa had mended so many years ago, carefully preserved in their trunk. Those stitches had held for decades, a testament to the care and skill that went into them. And the life they had mended together, built from two lonely people finding each other, had held just as strong through everything. "I love you," Henry said, simple words that held 33 years of meaning. "I love you too," Theresa replied. "Always have, always will." As darkness fell and stars began to appear, they went inside together to share dinner with their guests, to continue the work of caring and mending and building that defined their life. The cowboy had found his home, and the woman had found her partner, and together they had created something that would echo through generations. The torn shirt had been mended with careful stitches, and so had the loneliness in Henry's soul. And in the end, that was the greatest gift anyone could give or receive, the mending that came from love and patience and the willingness to see worth in broken things. It was, Henry thought, the very essence of a life well lived.